Hey guys, tonight we drift toward the sleepy slopes of Mount Helicon, yes, the very same mountain where the muses once sang in whispers that could lull even the rowdiest centaur to sleep. You're bundled in a slightly itchy wool cloak, the kind ancient goatherds wore, and you trudge up a narrow path where each footstep presses softly into the golden grass. Crickets chirp, lazy and disinterested, and a breeze plays tag with the olive branches. Somewhere to your left, a goat bleats like it's seen a ghost, or maybe just another goat. This is the sort of place where myths don't thunder in with lightning bolts or fire-breathing monsters. No, these stories begin with yawns, long stretches, and the low hum of distant strings. And tonight, the myth we're easing into isn't about God smiting mortals or epic sea journeys, it's about two stubborn goats, a divine instrument, and how music might have saved an otherwise boring hillside from turning into a full-on hoof war. You probably wouldn't survive a week here, to be honest. The goat stench alone could send a modern nose running back to the nearest hand sanitizer stand. But the silence? The gentle, humming kind? It's tempting. Especially for a god like Apollo, who hated noise almost as much as he loved compliments. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far these sleepy tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow a trail of hoofprints, oddly symmetrical, as if the goats were marching in military formation, though anyone who's ever met a goat knows better. These creatures are chaos on four legs, and back then, they were worse. Untamed. Unapologetic. Their horns weren't decorations, they were weapons, curved like commas in a very aggressive sentence. The goats of Helicon weren't your average snack-eating farm pets. No, they were rugged, mountain-born, and proud. And two in particular, whom local shepherds quietly referred to as Thud and Thunk, had developed a rivalry so fierce it echoed across the valley like very low-budget thunder. Historians still argue whether this feud began over territory, affection, or simply an ancient fig tree that just happened to grow in the one shady patch on the entire slope. Some fringe theories suggest the goats had philosophical disagreements, possibly over whether chewing cud was an act of contemplation or just habit. Goat scholars are a strange bunch. But for the human observers below, it was all very real. Goats clashing horns at sunrise. Goats clashing horns at sunset. Midday. Same thing. The sound was constant, bonk. Pause. Bonk again. It was like living beneath a xylophone being played by toddlers using helmets. You pause now at a flat rock halfway up the hill, imagining what it was like to try napping here 3,000 years ago. Spoiler, you couldn't. Not with that soundtrack. Of course, not all goats joined the feud. Most kept to themselves, gnawing bark, staring into the void, or plotting new ways to escape pens. But the tension infected the hillside like bad gossip at a family reunion. Even the bees were irritable. Now here's your mainstream historical fact for tonight. Mount Helicon wasn't just a pretty peak, it was considered sacred, home to the muses, and one of the birthplaces of artistic inspiration. Poets, musicians, and dreamers traveled here for centuries hoping a little divine magic might rub off on them. And that divine magic? It was picky. It didn't show up for just anyone. But on one particularly frustrating afternoon, when the sun was high and the goats were especially annoying, someone very divine happened to be nearby, and not thrilled. This was Apollo's neighborhood now. And Apollo, god of the sun, music, healing, archery, and unsolicited prophecies, had come to Helicon for a bit of quiet. A little sunshine meditation. Maybe a haiku. What he got instead? The goat version of a rock concert, minus any melody. You can almost picture him now, golden hair practically shimmering, robes artfully rumpled in a "this took no effort" way, standing at the edge of a grove, rubbing his temples while a dozen goats screamed about fig rights and bleated insults. Some say that was the moment inspiration struck. Others say he was just desperate. Either way, Apollo decided, if the world won't give me peace, I'll build it myself. O Yuri still on the hill, listening. The wind is soft, but the echoes of those goat arguments carry across time like badly tuned bagpipes. You duck under a crooked olive branch and reach a narrow plateau that once served as the neutral zone, the spot between the two goats' favored territories. The air here is still thick with tension, or maybe that's just the faint scent of goat droppings and pride. Thud and Thunk, as they were affectionately nicknamed, had taken their dispute to legendary levels. One favored the left side of the fig tree, the other claimed the right. One preferred mornings for grazing, the other insisted on afternoons. And both believed that their head-butting skills were the stuff of goat mythology. Now, the truth is, goats are naturally combative. They butt heads not only to establish dominance but occasionally just for fun, or boredom. It's like their version of Sudoku. But these two made it personal. Local shepherds would lean on their crooks, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion, watching the same confrontation unfold like clockwork. Bonk. Grunt. Step back. Bonk again. Repeat. Day in. Day out. Your sandals crunch over dusty stones as you imagine the sheer absurdity of it all. You almost feel bad for the shepherds. Which brings us to one particular soul, a man known in local legend as Demos, possibly short for Demosthenes, possibly just because he mumbled a lot. Demos had inherited his father's small flock, which unfortunately included both Thud and Thunk. He did not inherit patience. All Demos wanted was a nap. A solid, uninterrupted, lying in the shade of a tree nap. You know the kind, where even flies agree to buzz elsewhere. But instead, he was caught in the crossfire of two goats with titanium skulls and something to prove. Historians still argue whether Demos ever tried separating the goats, or if he simply developed the ancient Greek equivalent of noise-canceling thoughts. There's a temple carving in a nearby village that some say depicts him sobbing behind a rock while stuffing olive leaves into his ears. It wasn't all bad. Goats provided milk, warmth, and, in a pinch, very judgmental companionship. But two goats locked in a bloodless but relentless battle. That's not mythology. That's torture with hooves. Here's your quirky tidbit: ancient Greek goat herding techniques actually involved singing to the animals. Yep. Low, rhythmic chants were believed to calm them, not unlike how modern humans sing to plants or argue with their Wi-Fi routers. Some herders even had preferred lullabies depending on the season, songs for springtime births, summer heat, or, in Demos' case, managing anger-induced horn combat. You reach a crumbling stone where Demos likely sat each day, his face buried in his hands, contemplating how long it would take to walk to Delphi and beg the oracle for advice on goat mediation. And then, one scorching afternoon, the skies offered no shade, the figs drooped from their stems, and the goats reached peak volume. Bonk echoed so hard it rattled the teeth of a nearby tortoise. That was the day Apollo decided he'd had enough. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the layers of irony here. Apollo, god of order, of light, of celestial harmony, is being driven mad not by monsters or hubris, but by two angry mammals barely capable of spelling Lyre, much less appreciating one. So he appears. Just like that. No lightning. No fanfare. No choir of sunbeams. One moment the hillside is filled with goat brawls and muttered shepherd curses, the next, silence. Every bird freezes. Even the flies seem to hold their breath. And there he stands, tall, radiant, with that quiet godlike confidence that says, I can solve this. I've written poetry about worse. Apollo surveys the scene. Two goats snorting, panting, pawing at the ground. Demos somewhere nearby, possibly weeping softly into his tunic. And Apollo, in a moment of divine improvisation, decides to make something beautiful. Not for the goats, not even for Demos, but for the quiet. Now here's your historical anchor. Apollo is traditionally credited in myth with the invention of the lyre, a small harp-like instrument with 7 strings, each representing the harmony of the cosmos. He crafted the first one, some say, from the shell of a tortoise. Which raises the very uncomfortable question, where did he find that tortoise? Fringe versions of the myth claim the tortoise had been accidentally flattened during a particularly violent goat duel. Others believe it was a willing volunteer, eager to be a part of something greater than slow moss-eating and awkward sunbathing. Either way, Apollo's fingers begin working, plucking, tightening, tuning, and the first notes rise into the hot afternoon air like mist after rain. High, clear, soft notes, not commanding but inviting. Gentle like memory. Curious like a cat with one eye open. The goats freeze. Their ears twitch. Bonk is replaced by nothing. Just the slow stretch of silence that follows astonishment. You rest now against the cool side of a large boulder, closing your eyes as those first divine notes float through the centuries. The lyre was never meant to be a weapon. But it was powerful enough to stop 2 goats in their tracks. That's divine intervention for you. Not with thunder. But with strings. You can almost see it, the way the goat's posture changes, like 2 over-caffeinated wrestlers suddenly offered free massages. Thud lowers his head slightly, not in defeat, but in confusion. Thunk blinks twice, as if remembering a long-forgotten dream about clover and sun-warmed stones. The music, faint and otherworldly, coils around them like smoke from a distant campfire. Apollo keeps playing. He doesn't look at them, not really. His eyes are fixed on the horizon, where the sun has started to melt down the sky like honey over bread. His fingers dance over the strings, and each pluck seems to rearrange the atoms of the air, thickening it with something that feels like understanding. Some say it wasn't even music in the way we know it. More like sound made honest. Sound without competition. Whatever it was, it burrowed deep into the goats' ancient little brains and told them, maybe don't fight today. You continue up the slope, where grass grows softer now, as though the music still lingers in the soil. And there, beside a crooked tree stump, sits poor Demos, his eyes wide open, mouth slightly ajar, holding his crook like a man who just witnessed a miracle but is too tired to stand up and applaud. Thank the gods, he whispers, mostly to himself. And indeed, one of them is standing right there. Now here's a fun mainstream fact, the lyre became one of the central instruments of ancient Greek music, especially linked to education and moral instruction. Boys in Athens were often taught to play it alongside reading and mathematics, because what's democracy without a little harp practice? But for Apollo, this wasn't about human curriculum. It was about peace. Silence. Maybe even a bit of smugness. The goats were still. The hill was calm. And even the sun seemed to pause mid-descent, as though admiring its own reflection on Apollo's shiny forehead. Meanwhile, the goats weren't just silent, they were changed. Something deep had shifted. They sat down. Side by side. Not out of friendship, mind you, let's not stretch the myth, but out of mutual curiosity. Heads cocked at the same angle. Noses sniffing the same invisible melody. Historians still argue whether this moment marked the beginning of goat domestication rituals or was merely an isolated incident of divine goat hypnosis. Some point to cave etchings in Thessaly depicting goats near curved instruments, though one skeptical academic claims they're just oddly drawn loaves of bread. Your fingers brush a low branch as you pass under it, and you imagine what it would be like if arguments in your life could be solved this way. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Lyre solo. Neighbor's dog won't stop barking. Minor chord progression. Family debate over holiday plans. Pluck, strum, peace. It's worth noting that this was likely not the first time Apollo used music as a tool. Myths mention him calming wild beasts, lulling giants to sleep, and even persuading stubborn kings with a single verse. But calming 2 feral goats on a hot hillside? That's the kind of miracle history rarely records in marble. Here's your quirky tidbit, some lesser-known vase paintings from the late 6th century BCE show goats near musical instruments, not playing them, of course, but unusually attentive. One even has a goat gazing at a lyre while standing on its hind legs. Scholars can't agree whether this was symbolic of musical harmony or just ancient meme content. Back on the hill, the transformation begins to settle in. With the goats no longer battering each other like kitchen pots, the rest of the herd begins to relax. Younger goats stop flinching. Birds return to their perches. And Demos? Demos finally gets his nap. He curls under a cypress, the kind with bark that smells like pepper and resin, and dozes off with one hand still holding his crook and the other outstretched toward the sound, reaching, perhaps, for something he doesn't fully understand but desperately wants to remember when he wakes. And Apollo? He keeps playing. Not for long, gods have short attention spans and very long to-do lists. But just long enough for the hillside to remember what peace feels like. Just long enough for two goats to forget why they were angry in the first place. Because sometimes all it takes is a melody. You follow the fading notes down the other side of the hill, your sandals brushing through thyme and dry clover, and for a moment, you swear the air still trembles with music. Apollo, ever the dramatic type, has already vanished. No footsteps, no goodbye, just a faint warmth in the dirt where he once stood and the low hum of a string that never quite stops resonating. Now, here's the part no one expected, the goats didn't just stop fighting that day, they started listening. And not just in the ears twitching kind of way. More like appreciation. Thud and Thunk, the once feuding titans of goat rage, began spending time near the stump where Apollo played. Not butting heads. Just sitting. Grazing. Occasionally sighing with what could only be described as contemplative bleats. You walk past that very stump now, its bark rubbed smooth from centuries of lazy lounging and, according to local legend, more than a few generations of poetic goats. Demos, after waking from the best nap of his life, noticed the change right away. His goats no longer smashed into each other with the force of a minor landslide. Instead, they stood at odd angles, ears pointed toward the breeze, as though hoping for an encore. His life got quieter. His cheese production increased. His stress wrinkles reduced by at least 2. Historians still argue whether the goats were truly enchanted or simply stunned into civility. Some suspect Apollo implanted a divine memory in their tiny minds, a snippet of cosmic harmony they could never quite forget, even when tempted by the tastiest bark on someone else's branch. But the real transformation came a few days later. One morning, just as the sun slipped over the ridge and painted everything in sleepy orange, Thud trotted to the top of the hill and let out a bleat, not aggressive, not panicked. It was almost melodic. A series of rising and falling notes, like a child testing the sound of their own voice in a hallway. Thunk answered. Not with a bonk. But with another bleat, different, but in rhythm. This, dear listener, was the first documented instance of what later became known as goat harmony. Or, in some fringe circles, Caprine chorus syndrome. Demos, startled and mildly concerned, watched as the two goats took turns bleating, their calls bouncing through the valley in soft, echoing loops. Now here's your mainstream historical fact: in ancient Greece, music wasn't just for fun, it was believed to influence character. The philosopher Plato argued that the right kind of music could shape moral behavior, guide the soul, even stabilize society. He'd have been overjoyed, and deeply confused, by singing goats. And here's your quirky tidbit: there's an obscure philosopher from the island of Lesbos named Phorbus who reportedly tried to create a musical school for animals. He failed. His most successful pupil was a duck that danced in circles, but his notes reference a pair of goats who understood call and response better than most humans. Back on Mount Helicon, things got weirder. Other goats began copying Thud and Thunk. What started as two transformed grumblers became a chorus of curious bleats, all vaguely in tune. Demos, being no fool, recognized opportunity when he saw it. He began guiding the goats' morning songs with his flute, a humble reed instrument he hadn't touched in years. The goats, for reasons no one could explain, followed his notes. Not perfectly. Not even consistently. But enough to cause passing travelers to stop and wonder, is that music? Soon, nearby herders started bringing their own animals to Demos's hill. And for a while, Mount Helicon wasn't just the home of the muses, it was the stage for the world's first goat concert. Apollo, it said, watched from afar, amused and smug. But not everyone was pleased. Humans, as it turns out, don't like to be upstaged by animals. Especially in the arts. That part's coming. But for now, you stand at the edge of the goat field, eyes half closed, listening to the wind rustle through reeds and wondering whether you've ever been so moved by silence. Because once you've heard a goat sing, the world is never quite the same. The morning sun slides gently across the hillside, warming rocks and coaxing shadows from the trees. You shift your weight onto one foot, letting the rhythm of the breeze sway you slightly. It's easy to imagine the scene back then, rows of sleepy goats humming low and strange, their eyes half-lidded, tails twitching in time with a flute played by a very confused but increasingly proud shepherd. And not just any flute. Demos had whittled this one himself long ago, back when he thought music might make the goats behave. It hadn't worked then. But now. Now the goats sat in a loose semicircle, awaiting their morning notes like children waiting for story time. Some even swayed slightly. One chewed rhythmically on a blade of grass, as if keeping time. It wasn't quite a symphony. More like ambient sound with hooves. But to the few travelers who witnessed it, it felt like magic. And like most forms of magic, word got out. You hear the crunch of gravel behind you, imagination, of course, but it reminds you of the first skeptical onlookers who wandered up the trail. A pair of philosophers from Corinth. One carried a stylus, the other a pessimistic expression. They didn't believe the rumors. Singing goats. Nonsense. And yet, within 10 minutes of arrival, they were sketching furiously and whispering things like, possibly metaphysical, and, do goats dream of Euterpe? Euterpe being the muse of music, naturally. It wasn't long before the phenomenon made its way to Delphi, Athens, and eventually even to Apollo's less glamorous temple accounts department. Which brings us to a turning point, the moment when Apollo decided to get a little more involved. See, Apollo didn't do subtle. He might have casually strummed a tune to silence some goats once, but when people started attributing ongoing goat music to Demos alone, his ego felt the sting. Divine credit matters. So, in an effort to reclaim the narrative, Apollo returned to Helicon with a plan, to build a lyre, not for himself this time, but for public use. A kind of symbolic gesture. One that said, this was my idea, remember? Here's your mainstream historical fact, the earliest lyres were made of wood and gut strings, often carried by professional musicians called kitharotes. These musicians played during symposiums, rituals, and, occasionally, competitive games. Music was deeply embedded in public life, one part entertainment, one part spiritual hygiene. Apollo's new lyre was different. It was larger than average, crafted from olive wood taken from a sacred grove near Delphi, and strung with gold-threaded hair from the tails of sun lion cubs. Not real animals, don't worry. Just poetic license. Probably. The goats, of course, didn't care. They preferred the old sounds, the simple reed flute, the comforting bleats of their companions, the way Demos sometimes played off-key but always with love. But Apollo had an audience in mind. Humans. Specifically, the type of humans who hosted parties, debated logic, and judged things from theater balconies. Demos, to his credit, welcomed the god graciously. He even offered him cheese. Apollo declined, but not rudely. And when he revealed the new lyre and played a few notes, the hillside briefly shimmered with divine resonance. The goats did not join in. Historians still argue whether this was protest or just poor taste. Some say goats are traditionalists. Others believe Apollo's tuning was too rigid, too perfect. Whatever the case, Demos' goats stuck with his flute and their own strange rhythms. That's when the idea struck: Apollo would hold a concert. A friendly showcase to demonstrate the superior emotional power of the lyre. An audience would be invited. The goats would perform first. Then Apollo would follow. No judging. No pressure. Just comparison. Now for your quirky tidbit: the ancient Greeks loved musical competitions. Some festivals featured contests not just between human performers, but between genres. At one particular festival in Sparta, a bard once lost to a man playing a bucket with a spoon. The judges cited spiritual resonance. Back on Helicon, the stage was a ring of flattened grass, the sky pale with anticipation. The goats performed beautifully, or at least endearingly. Their bleats wove together with Demos's flute into a strange, sleepy lullaby that had half the audience napping before Apollo even stepped forward. Then came the lyre. Smooth. Flawless. Divine. Every note shimmered with technical perfection. The audience clapped politely. Then loudly. Then not at all. Because something was missing. Emotion. The goats had it. Whatever it was. And Apollo? He was brilliant, but distant. The concert ended not with applause, but with silence. You smile now, imagining the look on his face, a mixture of confusion, irritation, and dawning respect for the floppy-eared creatures who had somehow managed to upstage him with nothing but bleats and heart. The hill is quiet again as you press your hand against a sun-warmed rock. You can almost feel the vibrations of old applause, or maybe just the echo of a few polite hoof stomps. Goats, as it turns out, are not easily impressed by perfection. They prefer authenticity. And Demos's flute, uneven as it was, felt more real than Apollo's divine precision. Apollo, despite his pride, was no fool. He understood music. More importantly, he understood how it landed in the soul. And while he could outplay any mortal or god, he couldn't replicate what the goats had stumbled into, a shared experience of sound born from confusion, bleeding, and eventually, a kind of interspecies empathy. So instead of punishing them or storming off in celestial fury, like he had with Marsyas, that poor satyr who once challenged him with panpipes, Apollo did something even rarer. He smiled. And he left. But not before handing the lyre to Demos with a wink and a single instruction: use it when words don't work. Then he vanished into the glare of the setting sun, his sandals leaving no print, just a faint scent of myrrh and quiet disappointment. Now here's your mainstream historical fact: the lyre became a key symbol of Apollo, often appearing in sculptures and temple carvings, used to represent not just music but cosmic balance and rational order. The instrument itself was revered as a bridge between the earthly and the divine. But goats? Goats had their own ideas. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The goats, now a choir of sorts, began experimenting. Not with new notes, but with movement. Little stomps, head tilts, sways. Almost like dancing. Demos, ever the observer, adjusted his playing to match. He started adding pauses. Changes in tempo. The occasional drumbeat using a hollow log and a stick. And the goats responded. One day, a traveler from Delphi stopped to watch and was so moved he wept into his tunic. Not because it was beautiful, though it was in its own rustic way, but because it was honest. Raw. Unlike anything found in a temple or symposium. And so the goat music spread. Slowly. Quietly. Like a whisper passed from pasture to pasture. Shepherds began noticing their flocks behaving differently. Calmer. More focused. Less inclined to destroy fence posts with their faces. Some credited the altitude. Others, the cheese. But a few knew better. Now here's your quirky tidbit: in some remote parts of Arcadia, there are still traditional songs played on reed flutes that locals claim were passed down from goat rhythms. The melodies are irregular, looping, often featuring call and response sections believed to mimic early Caprine choirs. One particularly strange piece is nicknamed Thunk's Lament. No one remembers why. Back in Helicon, Demos found his life transformed. He was no longer just a sleepy shepherd. He was a kind of musical goat whisperer, visited by curious priests, bards, even a few skeptical nobles hoping to hear the so-called argument-ending music. But Demos didn't treat it like a performance. It was never meant to be that. When asked to show off the goats, he'd shrug and say, "You have to sit. And wait. And listen." The goats weren't circus acts. They were musicians. Unreliable ones, sure, but sincere. And while some visitors rolled their eyes and wandered off, others stayed. Hours passed. The goats would bleat a note here, sway there. And when Demos played softly, the music would ripple out like the scent of jasmine at dusk, unexpected, fleeting, unforgettable. Historians still argue whether this was truly a goat renaissance or simply a charming myth that got out of hand. One modern scholar even tried to replicate the experience using AI-generated bleats and Spotify, but the results were mixed. Mostly confusion. Some minor tinnitus. You pause now beneath a tree whose roots tangle with the old foundations of Demos's hut. Nothing remains but stones and the faint trace of a doorway. But close your eyes, and the air still hums with music. Maybe from the wind. Maybe not. Because here's the strange part. Even now, some say that on quiet nights, if the wind hits just right and the goats are in the mood, you can hear it, that ancient rhythm, that lullaby of compromise, born not from genius but from frustration. A sound that says, "I don't like you, but I'm willing to listen." And maybe that's all peace ever was. You continue along the old shepherd's path, where thyme and chamomile tangle at your feet and bees drift lazily from flower to flower, indifferent to your presence. The path curves toward a low hill, and at its summit, something surprising once took place, a goat council. Yes, a literal gathering of goats to decide something far more important than who got the shadiest spot. They were going to vote. Now, of course, goats don't have ballots. They don't wear togas or debate in iambic pentameter. But Demos swore, on several occasions, often while a little tipsy, that his goats had developed a system. He claimed that when he played certain songs, the goats would respond differently. Some would stomp, others would bleat, a few would simply lie down as if offering a very fuzzy abstention. It started with rhythm tests. Demos would alternate between a slow, plodding beat and an energetic, bouncy one. Some goats perked up to one, others to the other. Eventually, he realized the responses were consistent. That's when the idea struck, what if they were choosing? So one morning, he played two melodies, one inspired by Apollo's lyre, elegant and measured, the other by the goats themselves, chaotic and heartfelt. Then he watched. The herd split. Some stood closer to Demos when he played the lyre-inspired tune. Others grouped nearer the old fig tree when he shifted to the bleat-based ballad. It wasn't scientific, but it was something. Historians still argue whether this was true goat behavior or Demos projecting his own need for structure onto animals who mostly cared about snacks. Fringe thinkers, particularly those who believe in animal musical intelligence, have cited this event as early evidence of non-human preference expression. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The ancient Greeks experimented with all sorts of group decision-making, especially in Athens, where early democratic principles were born. While obviously limited to free male citizens, the idea of voting by raising hands or dropping pebbles into urns was part of daily life. Demos, perhaps unconsciously, mirrored this system. You step past a circle of sun-bleached stones, maybe once a fire pit, maybe just a sheep pen, but in your mind, you see it clearly. Goats positioned like a sleepy jury. Demos holding his flute like a gavel. A soft breeze moving through the trees like a breath between arguments. And the results? Goat democracy leaned toward the messy tune. The one with hiccups and pauses. The one that let the goats lead. It lacked polish, sure, but it felt true. Word of this vote spread, mostly as a joke at first. Farmers scoffed, musicians raised eyebrows, and one particularly stuffy philosopher from Thebes wrote a scathing critique titled On the Folly of Caprine Consensus. It did not sell well. But people kept visiting. And soon, goat music became a thing. Travelers came not just to hear it, but to ask questions. Could it soothe babies? Calm feuds? Cure melancholy? One rumor claimed a man from Corinth played a goat choir recording next to his snoring wife, and she immediately began dreaming of cloud meadows and woke up humming. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In the village of Askra, just below Mount Helicon, local craftsmen began carving miniature goat figurines with tiny lyres strapped to their backs. These quickly became popular charms for household harmony. Whether they worked is unclear, but one tavern owner claimed business doubled after placing 2 on the bar. Back up on the hill, Demos remained humble. He didn't pretend to understand what was happening. He just played, listened, and gave the goats space to decide, whatever that meant. And the goats? They didn't always agree. Some still butted heads occasionally. Some ignored the music completely. But the all-out war of bonk and fury had faded into something more manageable. You find a spot to sit, where the earth is warm and the air smells faintly of crushed mint. The sun filters through a branch above you in golden shards, and for a moment, everything is still. Because even in myth, even in stories that drift from truth like clouds from a mountain peak, there's something real hiding underneath, the idea that conflict can end, not with victory, but with curiosity. With a pause. A breath. A note held just a second too long. And if goats can find that, maybe anyone can. The trail narrows as you walk, winding between wild junipers and ancient olive trees. You pass a slope of soft rock where shepherds once carved idol doodles, mostly goats, some questionable lyres, and what appears to be a very badly drawn Apollo with 2 left feet. It's quiet here. Sleepy. The kind of quiet that makes you forget time. And maybe that's why people began to ask questions, questions that scholars are still trying to answer. Like, did this actually happen? Were there truly goats that responded to music? Or was it all a shepherd's dream, inflated by the warm sun and a few too many cups of honeyed wine? That's the thing with myths. They never stand still. They stretch, bend, blur. The story of the goat argument that ended in song might seem silly to modern ears, but it's lasted longer than most perfectly reasonable things ever do. And today, historians still argue about it. Some believe there's metaphor hidden in the hooves and bleats, an allegory about society, about how even the most stubborn creatures can be soothed by harmony. Others think it was a localized ritual, perhaps a lost fertility rite, where goats were symbols of Dionysian abundance, and music served as both offering and celebration. Then there are the fringe thinkers. Oh, the fringe thinkers. You meet them in scrolls and symposium footnotes. One claims the singing goats of Helicon were early attempts at animal husbandry experiments involving sound cues and selective breeding. Another insists the story is coded, about rival human tribes symbolized by goats, with Apollo stepping in as a neutral cultural force. A third believes the goats were merely hallucinated by a particularly lonely Demos who, in absence of companionship, created a musical delusion. But every theory, no matter how dry or wild, agrees on one point: something changed after Apollo played that lyre. Whether it was real, symbolic, or somewhere in between, Mount Helicon became known as a place of strange peace. The bleeding softened. The hills became quieter. And stories began to bloom in place of quarrels. Now here's your mainstream historical fact: Helicon was one of the most sacred mountains in ancient Greece, known as a haunt of the muses. Poets, orators, and artists often credited their moments of inspiration to something Heliconian, a nod to the belief that beauty could take root in even the stoniest of soil. And here's your quirky tidbit: one fragment of a lost comedy by the Athenian playwright Cratinus features a character muttering, "I'd sooner take singing lessons from a goat than hear another of your odes." Scholars long debated whether this was hyperbole, until they discovered that this line was written just decades after Demos's goat choirs were supposedly active. Coincidence? Maybe. But it smells like folklore sneaking into pop culture. You reach a small ledge that overlooks the valley below. A patchwork of vineyards, stone fences, and lazy trails unrolls beneath you. If you listen hard enough, you might almost believe the wind carries a note, a chord plucked ages ago that's still bouncing across the ridges. It's not just the goats that changed. People did too. Villagers who once mocked Demos began inviting him to gatherings. Not to play concerts, he always refused to perform, but to share his music the same way he shared his cheese and olives, casually, humbly, when the mood called for it. And more often than not, when disputes began to simmer, about pasture lines or wine barrels or whose child knocked over which amphora, Demos would raise his flute and play. No one expected magic. No one expected to cry. But somehow, the moment softened. Even if they were still mad, they were less loudly mad. And sometimes, that was enough. Here's what's curious. Some early laws in nearby villages adopted what scholars now call the Demos Clause, a rule stating that in times of civic disagreement, a period of silent music must precede formal debate. Yes, you heard that right. Before arguments, they listened. Not to lyrics or speeches, but to instruments. Quiet ones. Reed flutes. Small lyres. Bells made from sheep bones. And did it work? Depends on who you ask. But the towns that tried it tended to have fewer public fistfights and better cheese festivals. So as you sit here now, your back against sun-warmed stone, you realize the music never needed to be complicated. It just needed to give people, and goats, a reason to stop. To pause. To wait for the next note before shouting. Because that moment of waiting, that's where peace begins. You ease down the slope, the grass brushing your ankles, and soon find yourself on a familiar ridge, one Apollo had walked himself. Not long after the goat choir began to gather fame, he returned to the hillside. But not to bask in admiration or reclaim the spotlight. No, this time, Apollo had other business. A personal project. A feud of his own. See, if there's one thing Greek gods excel at, besides divine pettiness, it's multitasking. And while peace had settled over Helicon's goats, across the lands, another storm was brewing. A musical one. The Marsyas situation. If you don't remember him, Marsyas was a satyr. Half man, half goat, full of confidence. He'd found the aulos, double pipes, likely dropped by the goddess Athena, and played them so well he thought, I could take on Apollo. Yes, really. You pass a gnarled pine tree, the bark peeling like old parchment, and imagine Apollo returning here not with his lyre slung casually over his back, but with thoughts sharper than usual. His last musical contest hadn't gone so smoothly. Marsyas had challenged him publicly. And Apollo, divine ego still smarting from goat applause, had something to prove. Historians still argue whether the Marsyas challenge happened before or after the Helicon incident. Some believe Apollo's experience with the goats gave him a new appreciation for humble music. Others argue it hardened him, made him less patient with rival performers. Either way, the story ends badly, for Marsyas. Now here's your mainstream historical fact: the contest between Apollo and Marsyas is one of the darker musical myths. The rules? Each would play their instrument, and the muses would judge. Apollo, clever as always, added singing to his performance. Marsyas, with only windpipes, couldn't match. He lost. And depending on the version, was either banished, humiliated, or flayed alive. Brutal, right? But here's your quirky tidbit: some versions suggest that Apollo's punishment wasn't driven by anger, but disappointment. That he saw promise in Marsyas, and felt betrayed when that promise turned into arrogance. A few scattered texts even hint that Apollo wept after the punishment, a rare divine emotion, especially from the god of light and reason. Back in Helicon, Demos didn't know the details. He just knew that one day, Apollo returned, not in glory, but in silence. No divine glow. No dramatic gusts. Just a solitary figure who stood at the edge of the fig grove, watching the goats bleat a morning song, then turned and left without a word. Some said he was seeking comfort. Others said he was reminding himself that music wasn't always about victory. That sometimes it was about making sure two angry goats didn't knock each other into a ravine. You pause now, thinking how strange it is that gods and goats could be tangled in the same story. That a divine being known for sunrises and oracles could also be linked, however briefly, to farm animals and flute solos. But maybe that's the point. Apollo's rivalry with Marsyas was about pride. Control. Perfection. But what happened on Mount Helicon? That was different. That was music not for dominance, but for resolution. For rest. For letting something go. And in that quiet contrast, a lesson took root. One Demos seemed to understand instinctively. He never once tried to outplay Apollo. Never dared to boast. He just played when the goats needed calming and when his neighbors needed a breather from bickering. Historians still argue whether Demos even knew who Apollo was when he first showed up. Some believe he thought the god was just another wealthy traveler with fancy sandals. And maybe that's why Apollo liked him. No fear. No reverence. Just a guy with a flute and a desperate need for less bunk. You walk now through a patch of tall grass, soft as whispers, where legend says Marsyas' blood was once scattered by the wind, carried over the hills, settling like ash into the soil. Some believe that's what made the herbs here grow more fragrant. Others think it's just good compost. Either way, the land remembers. And as you keep walking, you realize something. This myth, odd as it is, isn't just about goats. Or music. Or even gods. It's about choosing to listen. Choosing peace over spectacle. And letting go of the need to win every argument. Even if you could. The sun begins to dip behind the ridge as you follow the winding trail into a grove thick with ancient trees, their trunks knotted and gnarled, like old fingers clutching secrets. A brook murmurs nearby, and somewhere beyond the trees, a very faint bleat carries on the wind. It's peaceful, so peaceful, in fact, that you almost miss the sound that follows. Singing. No, not from Apollo. And not from Demos, either. It's from a goat. Well, not singing in the human sense. But it's melodic, strangely so. A low, croaky, almost mournful tone that rises, warbles, and then settles into something like a sigh. You've stumbled onto the birthplace of something even stranger than goat harmony. This is where, according to the stories passed from shepherd to shepherd, goat opera began. Yes, really. It started, as these things often do, with a mistake. One of the younger goats, possibly a grandkid of the original thud or thunk, had a particularly dramatic bleat. Long, loud. Slightly nasal. One morning, in the middle of Demos's usual flute tune-up, this goat wandered forward and let loose a sound so mournful, so drawn out, that it made 3 other goats stop chewing and blink slowly at her. Demos, to his credit, didn't laugh. He paused. Played a soft minor chord. The goat bleated again, this time louder, more pronounced, and with an odd quiver at the end. And just like that, goat opera was born. Now here's your mainstream historical fact: ancient Greek theater often involved musical interludes, choruses that both commented on the action and helped express the emotional core of a scene. Tragedy and music were tightly intertwined. It's not a stretch to imagine early shepherd songs echoing this form, especially if sung in the open air. But goat opera? That was new. Word spread fast, though mostly through giggling travelers and skeptical villagers. They came expecting nonsense. They left with something that made them pause. The performances weren't polished, but they were sincere. The goats didn't follow cues. They followed moods. When Demos played slowly, the lead goat, now nicknamed aria, would walk to center stage, a flattish patch of moss, and bleat a solo. Other goats began to chime in. Some staggered behind like backup singers. One even tripped over a tree root and accidentally created the first dramatic death scene. Here's your quirky tidbit: according to one scroll from a wandering scribe named Thalos, the goat troupe once performed a version of the tragic myth of Orpheus. No one could follow the plot, but the sobbing in the crowd suggested emotional impact. Thalos notes, one man wailed into his wine and declared it better than Athens. High praise, or very strong wine? Unclear. You rest on a fallen log, imagining the scene. Demos, now graying at the temples, standing just off stage. A herd of goats arranged in lazy spirals. And in the center, Aria lifting her chin and belting a note so long and wobbly it made toddlers cry and philosophers reach for their styluses. Of course, not everyone appreciated it. Some critics declared it sacrilegious. Others accused Demos of ventriloquism. One traveling bard from Corinth shouted, "Fraud," mid-performance and was promptly chased off by a goat named Bramble, who'd learned how to charge in three-quarter time. Still, the opera continued. Not nightly. Not formally. Goats, after all, are creatures of whim. But every so often, under a full moon or just after a spring rain, they'd gather. They'd hum. They'd sway. And sometimes, they'd perform stories no one could understand, but everyone somehow felt. Apollo never commented on the opera. But there's a statue in Delphi, tucked in the shadows of the temple's eastern colonnade, showing a goat standing beside a lyre. Most think it's symbolic. Some think it's sarcastic. A few, though, believe it's a quiet nod from the god himself, a shrugging admission that maybe, just maybe, goats really did have something to say. And if you listen long enough, maybe you'll hear it too. The wind picks up a little as you follow the path downhill, threading through stalks of tall grass that sway like an audience applauding in slow motion. You're heading into the valley now, where the hills cradle soft shadows and even the cicadas seem to whisper. This is where the humans started copying the goats. It was bound to happen. After all, goat opera had become something of a sensation. Travelers described it with hushed awe, as if they'd witnessed not animals, but souls wrapped in fur performing tales older than myth. Word traveled to Athens, to Delphi, to Thebes. And as is the habit of people when they see something working, they tried to imitate it. The first to act was a wealthy Athenian named Meletios, who believed he could elevate the art. He brought with him professional musicians, stylists, a philosopher who specialized in goat behavior, and, of course, a tailor. Because if humans were going to sing like goats, they should at least look better doing it. They staged a concert. Not on Helicon itself, of course, no one dared touch the sacred hill, but nearby, at a smaller pasture cleared and decorated with olive branches and garlands. The singers wore tunics dyed to resemble goat fur. One had horns strapped to his head. It was ambitious. And deeply awkward. Because what Meletios didn't understand, what many didn't understand, was that the goats weren't performing. They were just being. Their music wasn't an act. It was a byproduct of boredom, comfort, curiosity. When the humans tried to recreate it, it came off forced. The bleats were too rehearsed. The rhythm too clean. It lacked the stumbles. The hiccups. The charm. Still, the trend caught on. Here's your mainstream historical fact: in the 5th century BCE, Athens experienced a boom in choral performance. Festivals like the Dionysia celebrated not only polished drama but choral experimentation. Some troupes leaned into satire and rural motifs, dressing as animals, exaggerating gestures, even mimicking natural sounds. It wasn't long before the tragoidia, literally, goat song, became a staple. And yes, that's the actual etymological root of the word tragedy. Scholars still debate whether it was named for the costumes, the sacrificial rites, or simply the raw, emotional sounds goats make when distressed. Historians still argue whether Demos's goats inspired this trend directly, or if it was just one of those strange coincidences where myth and culture swirl into something half-true. But there are records, faded, fragmented, of plays performed in rural towns with choruses arranged in four-hoofed pattern and bleeding breaks written into the script. Now here's your quirky tidbit. One obscure scroll from a theater critic in Naxos mentions a troupe called the Bleatniks, who toured coastal towns performing goat-inspired ballads of longing and salted cheese. Their most famous piece, Ode to a Withered Fig. Critics were divided. You push aside a curtain of hanging vine and enter a clearing. The air here is heavy with nostalgia, though that might just be pollen. The goats of Helicon are long gone, of course. But the stories remain. And not just here. In Rome, centuries later, certain flute motifs were still called caprini, goat-like. In Alexandria, musicians developed warm-up exercises called bleat scales. And in a tiny village outside Sparta, there's still a yearly festival where children wear goat masks and sing out their troubles before tossing them into the wind. It's all a little silly. And deeply human. Because humans need rituals. We need stories to carry our frustrations, our rivalries, our noise. And sometimes, the best way to process all that is to bleed it out, slightly off-key, under a fig tree. You sit down on a rock worn smooth by time. Maybe Demos sat here. Maybe a goat named Aria once sneezed in this very spot mid-performance. Who knows? But you get it now. This story wasn't really about Apollo, or perfection, or divine music. It was about messy, sincere expression. About how even goats, creatures often dismissed as stubborn and smelly, could teach us something profound. That not every argument needs to end with a winner. Sometimes it just needs to end with a song. The sky above is a slow-turning canvas now, washed in the faded peach and lavender of early dusk. You rise from your seat on the old rock, brushing dust from your palms, and continue along the narrow track that winds gently toward a place few visitors ever bother to go, the resting field of the goats. Not a graveyard. Don't worry. Just a soft, shaded pasture where the original herd, Thud, Thunk, Aria, Bramble, and the rest, eventually settled in their final years. Retired from performance. Retired from conflict. Just, goats again. They lived out their days peacefully, nibbling grass, snoozing under trees, and occasionally letting out long, weary bleats like old actors reminiscing about their stage days. And according to the stories Demos used to tell, they still reacted to music, especially the quiet kind, the kind without ambition. You step through a gap in the hedge and into the clearing, and you can almost picture them. Sunlight dripping through branches, dust motes dancing lazily in the beams, and an old goat with a cracked horn snoring loudly while another chews cud with great concentration. This place was sacred, in its own quiet way. Not because of magic, or gods, or miracles. But because it was earned peace. The kind you don't find until you've argued, tried, failed, listened, and finally let go. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Greek pastoral poetry, especially that of Theocritus and later Virgil's eclogues, shepherd life was romanticized as the epitome of peace and wisdom. Goats, flutes, lazy afternoons, these weren't just rural images, they were symbols of a life stripped of ego and noise. A reminder that quiet had value. Now here's your quirky tidbit. There's a minor folk tradition in northern Greece where elderly farmers leave a small bowl of goat cheese and a flute reed on certain hillsides, to thank the silent ones. No one quite remembers why. But it's always done in spring, and it always includes a moment of silence. And Demos? He aged like the goats, slowly, stubbornly, and with a touch of grace. His hands grew stiffer. His flute lost a bit of tone. But he kept playing, less often, more softly. Sometimes just for the wind. Sometimes for himself. Sometimes for the memory of a time when music stopped an argument between two horned lunatics on a hill. And occasionally, someone would join him. A traveler, maybe. Or a child visiting family. They'd sit beside him, watch the goats, and ask, "What are they saying?" He'd smile, not answering right away. Because goat music never meant the same thing twice. One day, long after the goat council disbanded and the last opera bleat faded into memory, a small group of villagers came to visit. Not out of reverence. Just curiosity. They brought wine. Bread. A lyre one of them barely knew how to play. And as the sun began to set, Demos handed over his flute, not in ceremony, just casually, and said, "Play something true." The young man looked confused. "True?" "Yes," Demos said, leaning back against a tree. "Even if it's wrong." "Especially if it's wrong." And so the lyre played. Crookedly. Hesitantly. Like a goat trying to dance. The notes weren't clean. The timing wandered. But it felt right. Because something about that flawed little tune made a woman in the group laugh. Made another close her eyes. Made Demos nod once before drifting off for a nap. That's when it clicked. The lyre, once a symbol of order and divine perfection, was now in mortal hands. Human hands. Clumsy hands. But real. And that, perhaps, was Apollo's final act. Not to teach goats. Not to impress critics. But to remind everyone, God, man, goat, that sometimes, music isn't about mastering the sound. It's about making room for it. Twilight deepens as you walk on, the sky now a rich navy curtain pricked with early stars. The air turns cooler, and the first sounds of night begin to stir, a sleepy bird's chirp, the click of insects tuning up for their midnight performance, and somewhere in the distance, the soft warble of a shepherd's flute. It's no longer Demos, of course. He's long gone, buried beneath a simple stone, likely surrounded by fig trees and goat hoofprints. But the music hasn't died. It never really does. Not in a place like this. Tonight, there's a new sound. It comes from the edge of the glade, where two musicians, young, unsure, and giggling nervously, are rehearsing. One plucks a lyre, missing more notes than they hit. The other holds a worn-out reed pipe, the kind that squeaks more than it sings. A goat watches them from a short distance, chewing slowly, judging gently. You sit nearby, not intruding. Just listening. And in that moment, you understand, the music isn't in the instruments. It never was. It's in the hesitation. The trying. The silence between attempts. That's where the story has always lived. Now here's your mainstream historical fact: lyres, unlike flutes, were often used in teaching. Greek boys were instructed in the lyre not just to entertain but to cultivate their souls. Aristotle even suggested that playing the lyre helped balance emotions, grounding a person in moderation. The Greeks believed the type of music you listened to, and created, shaped who you were. So what kind of people do flawed melodies create? Hopefully, kinder ones. Back in Demos's time, the goat music began to wane after a few seasons. The original herd passed on. The new ones, while curious, lacked the spark. Or maybe they were just different. The rhythms faded. The opera troupe disbanded. But the memory? That lingered. Some say Apollo returned once more, quietly, without lyre or entourage. Just to stand and listen. Not to intervene, not to inspire. Just to witness what his song had started. A god, standing in the grass, watching two young goats blink at each other in cautious truce. Here's your quirky tidbit: there's a centuries-old poem, scratched into the side of a clay drinking vessel found near Helicon. It reads, translated loosely, where goats cease their quarrel and music takes root, the gods are never far. Some claim it was written by Demos himself. Others say it was the work of a lovesick shepherd with too much time and too little talent. Either way, it's the only drinking cup currently housed in the Delphi Museum with a musical goat etched on its rim. You close your eyes for a moment, breathing in the wild thyme, the loamy earth, the faint scent of olive bark. You can almost feel the weight of that myth, the way it sprawls, not in epic battles or towering temples, but in overlooked corners. In two goats beneath a fig tree. In a nap interrupted by bleats. In a lyre built from a tortoise shell and a god's mild irritation. Because not all myths were meant to awe. Some were meant to soothe. To remind us that not every story has to be large. That piece, too, is a kind of legend. And sometimes, it's goats who teach it best. Now the young musicians have stopped. One yawns. The other lays their instrument down gently on a patch of grass. The goat, satisfied, wanders off to nibble a bush. No applause. No curtain call. Just the slow return of silence. And in that silence, a kind of harmony. The stars blink more clearly now, and the moon has claimed its place above the hills, a thin silver curve that casts soft light on the trail ahead. You continue walking, slowly, without urgency. There's nothing waiting but the end of the story. And even that feels like it's just another beginning. You find yourself near the spot where the goats first argued, where thud and thunk clashed horns, day after day, beneath the twisted fig tree. That tree still stands, surprisingly. Crooked, resilient, and scarred from centuries of leaning against mountain winds. Its trunk bears the faint groove of horns, smoothed by time. If trees could remember, this one would sigh and say, "It got better." You sit beneath it, and the world quiets even more. So let's revisit the scene one last time, two goats locked in a ridiculous feud. A shepherd too tired to intervene. A god who just wanted silence. And a sound, light, delicate, unexpected, that slipped between all three and changed the shape of the moment. Historians still argue whether the lyre's song had true magic or if it was simply the right sound at the right time. Maybe it was just enough beauty to interrupt rage. Just enough softness to pause a pattern. Some believe that's all peace ever is, not the absence of conflict, but the slowing of it. The gap between strikes. The breath before the next word. You lean back against the fig tree and look up. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the ancient Greeks considered certain places thin, where the distance between gods and mortals narrowed, places like Delphi, Delos, and yes, Mount Helicon. Pilgrims came here to ask questions, to hear the muses, to find clarity. Not always answers, but space to listen for one. And what better example than this? A god doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes he just plays a tune. And sometimes goats, flawed and stubborn, choose to stop fighting. Not forever. But long enough for something new to grow in the quiet. Now here's your quirky tidbit: a 17th century traveler from Venice wrote in his journal that he visited Helicon and heard music in the stones. No goats, no flutes, just a soft hum, like strings stretched beneath the earth. His entry ends with the line, "Perhaps the lyre still plays. But only for those willing to wait." You stay a little longer. Not because the story demands it, but because something in the air feels full. Like a room after laughter, or a field after a summer storm. The kind of fullness that invites reflection. It's strange, isn't it? That's such a small tale, a fight over shade, a divine musician, two bleeding beasts, could become part of the great tapestry of myth. But maybe that's why it stuck. Because we recognize ourselves in it. You've argued over small things. You've clashed, stubbornly, even when you forgot why. You've waited, wished for someone, anyone, to play something that would make it stop. And maybe, just maybe, you found peace in places you didn't expect it. Like a pause. Or a chord. Or a goat's off-key solo under a fig tree. So you sit here now, letting the quiet settle, remembering that even arguments, especially the dumb ones, can end with a hum instead of a shout. And when you finally rise, the fig leaves rustle gently behind you. No applause. Just the world breathing with you. Your final steps take you down into a wide basin, low and open, where the wind curls softly between stones. The moonlight gathers in pools across the grass, and every sound, every step, breath, breeze, feels amplified and softened at once, like the world is tuned to a lower frequency just for you. This is where the story ends. Or rather, where it hums quietly into something else. Because even myths, like music, never truly stop, they fade. They resolve. They drift into memory. You come to a stop near an old stone marker. There's no inscription, just a shallow carving of a lyre above two curved horns. It's subtle. Weathered. Someone's tribute, maybe, or just a reminder, here, once, things changed. You stand still, eyes half-lidded, and listen. The goats are gone. Demos is gone. Even Apollo has wandered on to newer audiences, newer egos to soothe. But the echo, that's still here. The soft tug of harmony between two opposing forces. The quiet that follows the chaos. The stillness born not of resolution, but of choosing to stop. Here's your final mainstream historical fact: in Greek thought, the soul was believed to be soothed, and even structured, by the right kind of music. Plato called it the movement of sound to reach the soul for the education of virtue. Aristotle said music imitated the emotions of the soul, and could therefore balance or stir the heart. But goats? Goats just listened. Then stopped fighting. And somehow, that was enough. Here's your last quirky tidbit: in one overlooked village festival outside Thessaly, a procession of children in goat masks still bleat their way through the square, each carrying a small instrument, wooden flutes, clay drums, or homemade lyres. The lead child sings the refrain, "We bleated once, but now we sing." No one remembers who started the tradition. But no one dares end it. So you exhale slowly. Let it all settle. The headbutts. The bleats. The golden string stretched across a tortoise shell. The shepherd who just wanted a nap. The god who didn't expect to stay. The goats who, despite everything, learned to listen. Because maybe that's what this whole myth has been about, not a divine lesson or a grand truth, but a gentle nudge toward stillness. A moment between notes. A space where even stubborn horns can rest. Now close your eyes, if they aren't already. Feel the soft earth beneath you, cool and steady, holding your weight like an old lullaby. The night is quiet, and each sound you hear fades just a little slower now. The wind brushing the trees. A creak of old wood. The faintest memory of a string being plucked far, far away. The goats are resting. The flutes are quiet. The lyre has been set down, its song still echoing somewhere in the folds of time. There's no more arguing. No more bleeding. Just a long, comfortable silence. Let your breath settle into a rhythm. No need to hurry. You've walked the hills. You've listened to the music. You've followed every strange, sleepy twist of this tale. And now, you're just here. Still. Safe. Carried gently by the memory of a story that didn't need to be loud to be worth remembering. A story about letting go of conflict. About listening instead of clashing. About knowing when to stop talking, start strumming, and maybe, just maybe, nap under a fig tree with your oldest enemy turned quiet companion. Let the sound of that idea carry you now, wherever your mind drifts. There's nothing left to do. No more notes to play. No more goats to tame. Just sleep. Just peace. Just the soft hum of a lyre in the dark.